Well, welcome to this, the sixth in the series of the Fireside Chats. Despite having a new campus, I still haven't quite convinced Professor Lang to give us a fire, yeah? But I'm working on it, so maybe by the next time we will, in fact, have a real fire here. You know, we've been traveling around the world with this series. We kicked off with the United States, we went to the United Kingdom, then we went to Italy, then we had China, then Germany. But now, we've done something different. We're not going for one country, we're going for 192 countries. And that's why Michael Leonard, I'm very pleased you're able to accept this invitation. Michael is really the man that's behind the reinvigoration of the UN Tax Committee, yeah? That's probably a fair comment, no? Or another one.
I can't comment.
You can't comment. No. He will comment when I say something he disagrees with, yes?
Yeah,
but I think one of the things that I've liked about the work you've been doing, Michael, is the way you've tried to give a voice to developing countries. Because particularly at a time when the international debate is so live, it's important that developing countries feel they have a place at the table and that they're listened to, yeah? And they're not forced to accept just what comes out of the OECD, yeah? So Michael has a long career in tax. You'll hear by his accent he's Australian, but he's okay, yeah? You can understand him, yeah? Michael and I worked together at the OECD for
3 years.
3 years, and then he decided he had enough of me and left, yeah? And joined the UN, yeah? So he has a lot of experience in the UN. It's interesting to look at the current mandate of the UN committee, because you're hitting all the hot spots, aren't you? I mean, you've got a BEPS group, you've got natural resources, you continue your work on treaties, and you've got transfer pricing, yeah? Your danger is that you could, in fact, become a sort of a BEPS organization if you're not careful, yeah? Because BEPS seems to cover everything, yeah? The format for the fireside chat is the usual format. There'll be a number of sessions that we'll go through. It's very relaxed, it's very conversational. I hope it's interesting. With Michael, I'm pretty sure it will be. We'll have 6 rounds of discussion, hopefully. The first is that Michael will explain a little bit what's the role of the UN, how it functions, because for you, Michael, it's probably very obvious what the UN does, but I think for these people and for all the people that are out there, the virtual crowd, and we have probably 300 or 400 people out there, yeah? The UN, I suspect, Michael, is a bit of a black box, yeah? So it's good, that'll be the first part of the discussion. Then we'll look at some of the issues in the treaty area, move on then to transfer pricing, see how you're going to follow up the report, particularly the chapter 10 of the report, which is the key part of the report, the minority part of the report, yes? There'll be an exaggeration.
Don't use the term minority.
You can see this is going to be fun, yeah? And then we'll talk about exchange of information, BEPS, you can't have any meeting these days without having a BEPS discussion, and then we'll finish up by talking about natural resources. So it's quite an ambitious agenda to get through in 90 minutes. I hope we actually do get through all 6 points. So at the end, I would like to leave some time for questions from the audience. Some of those people that are in the virtual audience, we still haven't figured out a way by which you could ask questions. Maybe that's the next step in the process that we'll have here. One innovation that we've decided for this particular series is that we are now going to be publishing the transcripts of the conversation, yeah? So Tax Notes will publish a full transcript of the conversation, probably in December, and also the Tax Policy Quarterly of Ernst Young, EW, that organization, EY, yeah? They will be putting out a shorter transcript as well, yeah? And that probably in December. So with that introduction, why don't we start, Michael, with what is the UN all about in tax?
Thanks, Jeffrey, and it's a privilege to be here in this very interesting new campus and with you again. As you said, we worked for three years. And I'll just say right at the start that well, first of all, I'll speak in my personal capacity.
Good.
Which means that I'm not necessarily speaking for the UN Tax Committee or the UN, but I'll speak on what I think the thinking is as I see it as Secretariat. And the second thing is, we'll explore later in closer degree, I've been very lucky while I've been involved with the UN tax work in that we've had a very, very good committee which has had some very good people on it, and which has had the willingness to go beyond just traditionally looking at double taxation. So that's something that will come out in the discussion, and it's a reason why I've been lucky to be involved when things could happen. Now, what does the UN do in tax? Well, the UN tax work or tax cooperation work is a very small unit within the Financing for Development Office of the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And really the mandate of that work is driven by something called the Economic and Social Council. And the mandate derives from the importance of what's called financing for development. That development is important, but it needs to be financed somehow. And those of us who are working in tax know that tax is a very important way of achieving that. So really our role is to assist developing countries in that aspect of financing their development. And that means, first of all, that they need to get money into the revenue. They are sovereign as to how they do that, but we can give guidance as to what may work or may not work in their particular circumstances. Secondly, investment is very important. So having an investment climate is important for the development of countries, and getting the right tax mix is an important part of that.
Of course, we have the World Bank doing business indicators, which I think you and I would agree is not very helpful.
Well, I think without commenting particularly on those indicators, certainly any sort of score sheet can be misused, and people may do things or not do things to get further up the table, and maybe not always for reasons that in the long run will suit them. And a second thing is that countries which really might be trying to do the right thing, but have maybe slightly more complex tax systems, which means the obligations are a little bit more complex, will be further down the ranking than perhaps they should be. And that's
very diplomatic answer, Michael.
Not a specific
so he
comment
agrees with me, basically,
about our friends in the World Bank, but a comment on those sorts of issues. And the third issue, the third aspect of our mandate, Jeffrey, is that developing countries need to have a role in setting the standards. And, this is very topical at the moment when we're talking about what the standards, particularly for multinational, should be internationally, that we need to make sure developing countries play more of a role in setting those standards that will work for them. And just finally on how it works, we actually, in the Secretariat, we take a lot of our direction from the UN Tax Committee, the Committee of Experts on International Cooperation in Tax Matters. That's a 25-person group which acts in an advisory capacity, chosen by the Secretary-General of the United Nations after nominations by countries. And it's a group which is intended to be representative of regions, of tax approaches, and to have sufficient gender balance. So it's meant to be a group which sort of epitomises the 193 countries of the UN, while recognising you can't have 193 people around the room dealing on an issue such as this effectively.
So what does that mean, the fact that this is somebody just dropped something here, but it's okay, yeah? No, you're not damaged, I hope, up there, Veronica, yes? You're all right? Excellent. So you don't have to worry that for the virtual audience, there's no accident here, yeah?
Coming to terms with the new building.
Coming to terms with the new building, exactly, yeah? The fact that it's a group of experts, doesn't it sort of undermine the recommendations that they made? I mean, what's the status of the recommendations that come out of the group, yeah?
Well, it doesn't really undermine them. It just means that the force of the recommendations comes from the strength of the underpinning argument.
Go ahead, Michael.
Yes, so I think what you're alluding to is this long debate about whether the Committee of Experts should be an intergovernmental body. Yep. And it's a debate which is still unfinished. Generally, the G77 plus China, which is actually about 134 or something countries, has been supportive of the body becoming an intergovernmental body, which arguably would give it more authority, not inherently, because it wouldn't make binding decisions. And that's a long-standing issue. My personal view is that eventually that will happen. And you know, one of the biggest arguments for it is that the OECD, which functions very effectively for its members in the tax world, it's an intergovernmental body. And also, as the committee is going broader than just double tax treaties, there's no one person, even yourself, Jeffrey, who's an expert on all the different subjects which will be covered. So that if it was intergovernmental, you would have a country would be the member, and they could put into a position, to the extent their resources allowed, they could put into position in a meeting the person who was expert in that area. So that's an issue, that's a debate which I hope doesn't go away, and as I say, my personal view is that eventually that will happen, but that's a very personal view, and really that has to be decided at much higher levels than me.
I think the key thing, in fact, is not so much the status of the committee, is getting adequate resources for the committee, and then being able to parallel the agenda of the CFA, yeah? But that's, you know, that's the way you move forward. You have a group on treaties, you have a group on transfer pricing, you have a group on each of the expert areas you're going. So you pull in the people that are actually working in these areas. Yeah. So by now, I hope the audience have got a better feel, in fact, for what the UN Tax Committee is all about. It's a very old committee, isn't it? What was it, 1960?
I can't remember the original date, but there's been several committees, and the interesting thing is initially it started off just as being double tax treaties, and it's got broader in its coverage, and it also meets more regularly. And initially, of course, the work started in the League of Nations.
So a committee with a long history. Then, I want to move to the second round of topics. Then, what are, you know, from your perspective, what are some of the priority issues that the committee is looking at in the area of tax treaties? I mean, your things on the cross-border services. What do you, if you had to identify two or three?
Well, I think without choosing between the children of the committee, there are a few which I think really stand out as important issues, and one is the treatment of services. You know, the treatment of services is very different in the UN model than it is in the OECD model. There's quite a traumatic debate in the OECD on the services PE, the fact that do you follow the same rules in determining whether you have a permanent establishment, i.e. whether there's sufficient economic connection with the country for the source country to tax you. And the outcome there of that discussion was a minority approach, which is very similar to the UN majority approach. And you might think that that shows a coalescing of the models, but I think the fact that in the UN there's a clear majority in favour of treating services, permanent establishments as having been achieved a little bit easier than goods permanent establishments, and that's a minority, very much a minority in the OECD. I think that's very significant. The other thing is...
On that one, does the committee often split in sort of OECD on the one side and non-OECD countries on the other side? Or is it a mix?
I think statistically there's often views which are more predominant amongst OECD or people from OECD countries because they act in their personal capacity. But it's not always the way, and you know, I sometimes get a little bit annoyed when people look at where our members come from and say, well, to give an example, Chile or New Zealand, OECD countries, they will always take the position of residence country taxation, which in our experience is not actually the way things pan out. And I think the members have tried to look at these things in a way that recognises the importance of what they're doing for developing countries, that it's not just about their country. And also in the OECD, there are some countries which are more source country oriented than residence country oriented. That is more as the big divide between giving how much the source country needs to give up in a tax treaty negotiation. And on that, the fees for technical services issue is another differentiation from the OECD model. The committee has decided that the UN model will have a provision for countries on fees for technical services. And I think that's a really good decision. It's going to be a difficult
provision. You just started that work, though, isn't it?
Well, it's been in gestation for a while, and there was a draft alternative provisions, which Brian Arnold, who's been working with Lisa Lotkana, has proposed, and next year they are to provide a full article with a commentary on that. So that'll be quite difficult, because you know, how do you differentiate these technical services which get a special treatment which is advantageous to the country from where they're paid. So that's a very important issue, and to me the relevance is it's a recognition that countries are using these provisions, and it's an affirmation that developing countries, a lot of them want this sort of provision, and that the UN will say, you know, I can predict this part of the outcome. The committee will say, the choice is yours as to whether you have one. There's some pros and some cons. There's always some pros and cons, and one of the cons will be the difficulty of defining exactly which services are covered, you know, not discouraging the right sort of services coming into your country. But they're already out there, and I think the UN can play a good role, including even for business, of steering the countries that want to have a fees for technical services article down, you know, 1 or 2 roads rather than 50 roads or so. That's a very big issue. And another big issue is Article 9, which is really transfer pricing. Yes, the arm's length principle. But the arm's length principle is not in play in the redraft. Well, one can never be entirely sure. I mean, even the OECD BEPS action plan suggests that sometimes it might have to be departed from. But the work is actually changing the commentary on Article 9, bringing it up to date, reflecting some of the issues in the past, and some of those issues have been the feeling amongst some committee members that it actually paid a bit too much deference to the OECD transfer pricing guidelines. They're very respected guidelines, but there was some concern, for example, that the previous wording of the UN model sort of suggested countries should follow them automatically, which would imply even when they changed. And some members felt that, you know, we really don't want to give a blank check, and you know, we will, as I said earlier, we will pick them up to the extent that they're good for developing countries through the filtering mechanism. So, you know, those are perhaps 2 of the big issues, specifically on double tax treaties. Other areas of work will cover some double tax
Do you see there could be some scope for convergence on the P issues generally between the OECD, or call them the advanced economies and the less advanced economies?
Yeah. Well, one of the issues, the other treaty issues, which is a big one in the UN at the moment, is the amount of physical presence required under the permanent establishment article. And, you know, even within the UN, and remembering that OECD countries are UN countries, I think there's a lot of philosophical division about what the test of physical presence should be. So, you know, it will depend, but even among some OECD countries, there's concern in the digital economy particularly that source countries are not getting the taxation rights that they should. So maybe to some extent there will be convergence in that area, but it really depends on what happens with the OECD model. I think there'll always be a tendency in the OECD model to be more residence country based. There will always be a strong tendency in the UN model for the source country to give up less taxation rights in a double tax agreement, and I think that will impact upon PEs. But as I say, there are, even in OECD countries, there are more source country oriented members.
Do you think that we could eventually envision a situation, in fact, where we no longer have a UN model, an OECD model, but we have one model, which has been broadly endorsed by the whole international community, and which allows countries to set out their positions? Because we're not far from that already. You know, the volume 2 of the Model Convention actually enables OECD countries, non-OECD countries to set out their positions. Wouldn't that be a more productive way to move forward?
Well,
and we could change it. It doesn't have to be yellow or blue. It could be red.
Yeah. Well, you know, we always need to think about our colour. Ours used to be yellow, and then we chose blue, which was already the colour of the...
maybe that was the first step.
Yeah, so now our model is green to differentiate it. No, I mean, philosophically, yes. Because really both models are seeking to say there are options, you know, this and these are the options, and each of the options, as I said, has pros and cons. If, for example, you have very high withholding taxes on intellectual property, you might not have the intellectual property coming into the country, and you may actually not get any money because it doesn't come in. But on the other hand, if you set it too low, you may not be getting the economic benefits that you need for development and for assisting your poor and so forth. So philosophically, I agree. The issue is, though, is the memberships are so very different that the different issues will be relevant at any particular point of time. And the fees for technical services article, you know, that's not a high priority for the OECD. So, you know, there's not work being done on that. And other issues, some of the issues that the OECD at the moment is doing for its 2014 update are probably not such high priorities for the different membership of the UN. So I think we should try to minimise the differences, and I think the committee and the Secretariat has been, you know, very sensible in saying with our limited resources, we shouldn't unnecessarily do, redo what the OECD has done well, but we need to assess what it means for developing countries. And also sometimes we have to go out a little bit ahead. We actually did that on climate change. I think we went a little bit ahead, and you know, even on transfer pricing, I think we have actually influenced the way the OECD has looked at this. And just as a final example of where I think the outcomes might be different, and this is, I think, a big issue for international tax policy at the moment. You might have a complex solution to an accepted problem that works in the OECD member context, but it might not work in developing country context. And an example of a complex approach is probably the new Article 7, the authorised OECD approach. I think even a lot of OECD countries find that you know, that maybe that's too complex, or it's not, the game is not worth the candle, and are not pushing for that. But I think that's a classic example of something where even if it works for OECD countries, it's less likely to work for developing countries because of their stretched resources and, you know, the realities. And I think something we who work in a, you know, in some senses at a fairly high level. I remember when I was at the OECD, there was huge interest in taxation of supermodels, and you know, all these issues about taxation.
Supermodels are not young ladies that model clothes, by the way. Yeah.
Well, my contribution was to point out that we did have a male supermodel, Fabio, at that stage, showing my age. So it wasn't just about taxation of what we normally think of as supermodels. But to me, that sort of demonstrated that we always have a risk, both in the OECD and the UN. We do have a risk that we will pursue something which is intellectually interesting, but is not really that relevant for, particularly for developing countries, where they're often dealing with some really basic issues at this stage of their development, and the taxation of supermodels is far down the road.
But I mean, that's what I've seen, you know, when I worked at the OECD, that there's always a danger that the treaty negotiators, they get it put in a box and they lose the connect with the domestic tax legislation. And at the end, your treaty should reflect what you're doing at the domestic side, yeah? Or at least the domestic, you know, the treaty should not be a constraint on what you want to do if you think it's good tax policy. Well, why don't we move on and talk about transfer pricing, because I think the work that you initiated of having the UN draw up a manual for the application of the arm's length principle, I mean, that, I think, was a very good example of how you were breaking out of the treaty box, you were going into an area that was highly topical, highly controversial, highly political, yeah? How did you, were you pleased with the outcome from the report?
Yeah, I'm very pleased with the outcome, because at one stage it looked as though there might not be an outcome. And it's an imperfect document. It's, as it says itself, this is the transfer pricing manual. which is Practical Manual for Developing Countries, which has just come out in hard copy form, Jeffrey, so I'll give you a copy before I leave. And it's available on the UN website free of charge, or you can buy printed copies at the UN bookshop. And I think that's a really important document in a lot of ways, and a lot of the importance is saying, we, the Tax Committee, recognise that transfer pricing is an issue for a lot of developing countries, not necessarily all, but for a lot of developing countries. So it's meeting a need, and initially, most of the people on the committee were not transfer pricing people. They could have said, no, let's leave that to others. But they used the subcommittee system, and the Tax Committee can only meet 5 days a year and makes all its decisions for the year then.
Is that a budgetary issue? They can only meet 5 days?
No, it's constitutional. Yeah, it's constitutional. So that means it has to rely on subcommittees. And fortunately, we had a very good subcommittee on transfer pricing, a huge subcommittee, as large as the committee.
As large as the committee, wasn't
it? Yeah, led by Stig Soland and of Norway. And, they had a very vigorous debates about things like comparability. We had the competent authority from India. We had a very well-respected expert from the United States and other people, including people that you work with, involved in that. And, actually, in the end, most of the differences could be dealt with in a way that was still helping developing countries, because a lot of the really technical issues are not big issues for developing countries who are just starting on the issue. And that's something we have to understand, again, that what might be fascinating for us and might cause us to lie awake at night, technical issues, may be, at least for the moment, far down the track for developing countries. We say transfer pricing is a journey, and I think this is the first stage of the journey. We have to follow it up with capacity building, which we will. We have to follow up with dealing with this almost intractable problem of what happens if you don't have comparables. If you're a developing country, even South Africa says in Chapter 10, well, we can't really find relevant comparables, but we still have not given up on the arm's length principle. We think you need to take a holistic approach. So I think that work has actually been good in that a little bit of healthy competition. I think it's encouraged the OECD even to be more pragmatic, and we learn from them, and I think sometimes they learn from us too. So I think it's important, but it doesn't deal with everything that needs to be done, and particularly the developing countries that just don't have comparables, and the transfer pricing is a very complex issue. They don't yet have enough people on the ground to work on it. They don't have the information. They may not have access to databases. That's where we need to do better. It's in good hands, that work, with Stig Soland involved in the subcommittee, which will look at the next version, which will include things such as dealing with intangibles and intra-group services, which is a big issue for a lot of countries.
Are you going to look at the issue of safe harbours? Because you keep emphasising the low capacity of a typical developing country. Surely safe harbours is one way which you can sort of help them.
Well, safe harbours are, and I give you credit, Jeffrey. We didn't work this up before. That when we were involved early in this work, I think you recognised quite early on that the traditional OECD approach of saying, safe harbours are contrary to arm's length principle. Let's not encourage them. That really wasn't realistic for developing countries, and I could never see why something that was at the option of taxpayers could be contrary to the arm's length principle myself. And I think that's to some extent simultaneous approaches in the UN and the OECD of becoming more pragmatic, not throwing everything up in the air. You need sufficient certainty for business, but also for administrators so they can learn from each other. But you do need to be a bit more pragmatic. So there's something in there about safe harbours. Personally, I'd like to see something more in the next manual. It's not specifically listed on the things to be in the next version of the manual, but it could be, because it is very relevant. Again, transfer pricing is a journey, and I think we've got out of the mindset that you have to have the perfect transfer pricing set up when you first get into transfer pricing. And, you know, there are issues of advanced pricing agreements or arrangements. You know, for a lot of developing countries, I think the answer might be, in the long run, they're very good. They give certainty to taxpayers. You learn from the process. But I think for a lot of developing countries, they've reached the conclusion that in the early years, their best resources are not spent on having their, you know, the best and brightest working on taxpayers who are likely to be basically compliant, that they should go after the low-hanging fruit of the clear non-compliers. Different countries have different views on that, but it's, you know, that's a related issue.
Yeah, it depends on how important your small group of multinationals are for you, because, as you say, the great thing about APAs is it's a very effective way of training your tax auditors in a particular sector, because once you've done one pharmaceutical company, you know, you can move on and do the rest. You know, one of the interesting things, and you keep emphasizing this, Michael, is that we seem to be moving away from making transfer pricing a religious debate, yes? You're either in the Catholic camp of it's all arm's length, or you're in the, I don't know, the Islamic camp of it's all, you know, sort of global formula apportionment. And the reality is those days have gone. As soon as the OECD in '95 endorsed profit-based methods, you're on a spectrum. And the whole debate that's going on at the moment at the OECD in the UN is, where do you want to be on that spectrum, yeah? But as soon as the 95 decision, elements of formula apportionment are being built in, yes. And I think it's very positive that both the manual and the latest work coming out of the OECD is recognising that. It's, you know, so it becomes a much more pragmatic approach.
Yeah, this is a classic dilemma in this area, because some people will say, no, this is terrible, we need certainty. And my response always is that you've probably heard it before, is that everyone wants certainty, everyone wants one rule, but then you speak to them and you might want to drive on the left-hand side of the road, or the right-hand maybe in your case, me on the left-hand side, and, you know, you're not always going to get absolute agreement. So what's the answer? And this is relevant to, I think, a lot of the discussions at the moment. Do you pretend you've got agreement when you haven't, and know that in effect it's not going to be implemented, because you ultimately can't force countries to do what they don't believe in?
I tried for a number of years. But
I wouldn't. I don't have your moral force, obviously, but you know, or do you just recognise that and try to, as I say, limit the areas of difference and make clear the pros and cons of taking a particular path, including that if you take a divergent path, you're losing the benefits of consistency, which is an attractive thing for investment that's been lost, and also for yourself. I always believe that developing country administrators benefit if they're following the same rules as particularly the region, because they can learn from the region, they can, you know, we're looking at exchange of information being more important. But my general take on that debate is that, you know, all these views are personal, but this is very personal, that I don't think we're going to have global formulary apportionment in my lifetime. And, you know, there's a lot of reasons for that. But the main reasons are that I think that you couldn't get an agreement that suited every country in the world. And even if you appeared to have an agreement, there would be winners and losers. And the losers would probably be more likely to be developing countries than developed countries. So that's an issue. The other issue is that people forget that where it's arguably worked, say in the US states, and some people will say it's wonderful, some people will say it's terrible.
It's wonderful for tax plans.
But even there, you do have the multi-state commission, which is intended to reap some of the benefits of formulary apportionment by helping essentially the smaller states, as I see it, so that they don't have to redo all the calculations about the global income and so forth. And we won't have that same body at the international level. So developing countries won't have the benefit of an overviewing body which does all the calculations and so forth. So, you know, I think there's some issues, but the debate has been very helpful, because I think it has focused on exactly what you've said, that a lot of the things in formulary apportionment, a lot of the analyses of essentially of where value is created in particular, a lot of those considerations really already come into transfer pricing. They come into the way that profit splits are done. They even come into, we have joint audits. People who are involved in joint audits have said to me, these factors are effectively relevant. So I agree. I think once we get away from the philosophical purism of either arm's length or of global formulary apportionment, and I'm glad that a lot of the proponents of formulary apportionment are now talking about it as a unitary tax, getting away from the global, which is probably a branding mistake. So I honestly believe that the more we integrate those ideas, then the more chance we have of something that is reasonably certain, not perfectly certain, it will never be perfectly certain, but is pragmatic, and it works reasonably well for both developed and developing countries. Sort of like democracy, reasonably well.
In terms of alternative. I think the link to this is this whole question of country-by-country reporting, and then the documentation standards that you require for transfer pricing. Last week the OECD had a big meeting there. They talked about the master file. It's a funny term, but the master file, the local files. All of that type of developments are going to help developing countries because it'll enable somebody sitting in Zambia or in Senegal, they'll be able to get a sort of a global picture of how that multinational operates, not just within their countries, but on a global basis. Yeah,
potentially. There are a few wrinkles, and I don't want to be negative. I think it's actually a very good development, but a few wrinkles, or potential wrinkles, which I think came out in the discussion. And one of them is, if you know their country, what they've earned in each country, it doesn't necessarily tell you much about the links between the entities in the different countries and how they deal with each other, which is relevant to transfer pricing. But more importantly, I think there is an issue about will developing countries reap sufficient benefit from this? And
but is the UN sort of broadly supportive of country-by-country reporting?
Well, the UN on this, the committee hasn't actually formulated a view on this. I think it would be broadly supportive, but it is, particularly at the moment, one of the big issues was the confidentiality, and it seems to be coalescing around that the report is made available to tax authorities rather than the broader public. Now, that will draw criticism from the NGOs who have largely driven the debate that it shouldn't be left to government. And I won't comment on that debate, which is an intricate one. But one of the other issues is, yes, it goes to the mother country of the MNE, as I understand it, the current proposals, and then it, using its treaty network, etc., makes it available to other countries where it's satisfied that the confidentiality requirements are met. Now, there is an issue about making sure that confidential information remains confidential. My concerns in this area are that the lack of treaty networks doesn't disadvantage developing countries. And secondly, that where the information is truly confidential in that country, that the confidentiality aspect is not used as a way of not giving information to a country.
I've got a problem with that. Why should the number of employees that you have in a country, or whether you have intangibles in a country, or whether you have holding companies in a country, how much tax you pay in a country, how much profits you have, why should that be confidential?
Well, I think there's a good debate about whether the confidentiality requirement is being used as a way of limiting access to information which shouldn't be confidential, but which might assist tax authorities. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of the information should perhaps not be confidential, and maybe there has to be a differentiation between what's confidential and what's not. Because this is a concern I have, that the confidentiality requirement will be used to keep information unavailable to authorities, which should have it, which would help them do their work, and which is a legitimate thing that they need to do their work. So I guess it depends on what information is available, and this is behind the NGOs saying it should be public. Yeah. It should be public.
Well, particularly in today's age as well. Do you think, in fact, that for a very sort of underdeveloped country with a weak tax administration, maybe part of the answer is just to outsource transfer pricing, give it to one of the big four, and say, fine, off you go?
Is that a promotional?
No.
Well, I mean, without commenting specifically on that, I mean, customs, there's a lot of outsourcing. So, maybe that will happen over time. I mean, I think for a lot of developing countries, transfer pricing shouldn't be seen as a panacea, and this is another thing that I'm a little bit concerned about, that there's so much concentration on transfer pricing that the problems for a lot of least developed countries and less developed countries about just getting their taxpayer, knowing their taxpayer base, and dealing with the non-transfer pricing issues, dealing with the numbers of potential taxpayers who are not in the system and so forth, and making sure that they have the so-called tax morale, that there's an incentive to pay tax because you actually believe it's being used to develop the country, or at least that there's an incentive to pay tax amongst people who are disposed to pay tax. So, but it's that's certainly food for thought as one alternative.
Because in a sense, in some ways, I think you could say the OECD has perhaps done a disservice vis-a-vis developing countries, because we push so much the tax treaty aspects, the exchange of information, transfer pricing, where in a typical developing country, the first priority is get your tax administration working, Because without that, you can have whatever international rules you want, you're not going to be able to do transfer pricing properly, you're not going to be able to exchange. And and in a sense, I mean, working on transfer pricing is far more sexy than doing, audits of SMEs, So there's a real danger that the brightest and the best actually get diverted to these international issues, rather than focusing on that. Something that you and I
I'll just mention that something you'll remember. There was a very good report to the G20 from the OECD, the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, and some regional bodies, which was actually, was about helping how the G20 could help developing countries, have effective tax systems. And, I thought it was a really good report. Not much happened in relation to it, but but it's a report that I think emphasised a lot of those issues, and it was surprising. Maybe I was wrong to be surprised that all those bodies could work on something which suggested, for example, that developed countries should take more responsibility for their MNEs paying their taxes in other countries. I think one of the big problems in the world at the moment is that countries are very clear that against tax avoidance in their own country, but the spillover effects in other countries they're not so concerned about. And again, that was a good report, because it said you should do spillover analyses of your legislation to say, well, what does this mean for other countries? And I think even in the Netherlands, they're starting to think about the effects of their system on developing countries. I think that's a good development. I think it was a very good report, which transfer pricing was part of that report, but it was only a small part.
I mean, this is a report that was done by the organisations that form the International Tax Dialogue. It was put to the Cannes G20, and it's probably fair to say it wasn't the centre of the debate in Cannes, I think it will come back, because there's some good ideas.
It wasn't technically an international tax dialogue, Patrick.
Yes, I know.
Since we are not members, since we're not members in the UN of that, it was the organisations.
The organisations came together with our friends in the UN, and we were able to agree on that. Why don't we move to the fourth round, which is the exchange of information? I mean, there, in a sense, there has been a revolution. There's no other way of describing it. There are very few finance ministers today that get up and say we favour bank secrecy as a shield behind which tax evaders can hide. I didn't say every, just very few. So there's been a whole change of attitude there. How far are developing countries benefiting from this, Michael?
It's really hard to tell on the ground. I always have a little reserve on the exchange of information because we really have to wait until developing countries are seeking more information from developed countries to find how quickly it comes. There's a few wrinkles in this area as well. One is the lack of treaty relationships, which might mean you can't seek that. Now, you might say, well, if you can't get a double tax agreement, usually because the developed country doesn't at that stage want to negotiate one with you, you should have just a narrow exchange of information agreement, which, that's one possibility, but on the other hand, you might be giving away one of your good bargaining chips in getting a comprehensive double tax agreement. So,
but I think to interrupt you there, though, it's if you're dealing with an offshore financial centre that doesn't have a real tax system, the last thing you want to do is to give them a treaty, yeah?
Yeah.
It's one of the side negative effects of the OECD work. We've actually helped countries that don't have very sophisticated tax systems to become more effective tax havens because they get a treaty network.
Yeah.
And that's something that wasn't quite intended.
Yeah, and the amount of information exchanged under EOI, not EIO agreements is a bit narrower than whether you call it the international standard. The international standard seems to be changing all the time.
Well, that's sort of a nice introduction to the next question I wanted to ask you on automatic exchange of information. Because, we haven't bedded down on request, and now suddenly we're told the new standard is automatic. Your views? Yeah.
Well, I think basically it's a positive development because it's hard to know what to ask for. Again, it'll depend on how it operates in practice. When small developing country goes to big developed countries and said, look, I need this information, whether it comes in sufficient speed. And also there are issues about, whether the information will be able to be easily integrated. When I was in Australia, we used to get information from another OECD country, and we really couldn't make much sense of it because of the format. So there are some issues there. The other thing is that there is some concern among some developing countries that they might get more of the burden and less of the benefit. And that would be particularly if they put in requests and they weren't met, that they might have a stream of requests and they have to use some of their best people to deal with that rather than to go out and audit non-compliant taxpayers. So it's a balance. I think it's a positive development, but there needs to be some heed to the administrative impact on developing countries. In our Article 26, we give a little bit more mention of that than the OECD about the impact on developing countries and that the developed country may have to assist essentially financially in getting some of this done. There are some, but it's a good development because it also emphasises double tax treaties are not just about avoiding double taxation. They're also about dealing with tax avoidance and evasion.
And I think if that's one positive outcome from the BEPS work, that in fact, we're getting more of a balanced approach in terms of avoiding double taxation and avoiding double non-taxation.
Yeah.
But do you think, in fact, that the large OECD countries are going to be prepared to exchange automatically information with pretty sort of less developed countries that have perhaps not a culture of protecting confidentiality?
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't like them to jump to that conclusion. And as I said earlier, I wouldn't like that to be used as an excuse where there genuinely is the sufficient amount of confidentiality. Confidentiality on things that need to be confidential is important, as I've mentioned and you've mentioned. So I really don't know, but my hope is that if that happens, it happens on genuine grounds and that there's assistance to those countries in helping them get up to standard, because I think too often in the past we've sort of said that, we put an imposition upon developing countries, but we haven't done enough to actually help them meet the standard. And I think things have improved in that area. I think the OECD does more work in helping countries meet those standards. But this gets back to the point, when you're setting those standards, you need to have developing country involvement as to the art of the achievable. Yeah. And they need to feel that they can achieve what they need to, and particularly that it's not going to be used as an excuse just for a small group of countries to exchange information, but not to give it to the developing countries which desperately need it. Final thing is, of course, we need to assist them so that they can analyse that information and make sense of it, because we all know, particularly from transfer pricing, you can have information embedded in a lot of stuff, and unless you really know what the key information is and how to use it, it's not helpful of itself.
I think, in fact, that even before you enter into an exchange, you need to have the capacity to match up the information that you get from your treaty partner, because if the information is coming in a format you can't do that, forget it. It's not just worth the investment. What do you think?
You need the batteries for the Christmas present.
Exactly. And I know a lot of tax administration that even in OECD countries don't have that capacity.
Yeah.
So it's not just a developing country issue, it's also an OECD issue. But what about this new development of the Multilateral Convention? I mean, you know, Michael, we worked a lot, in fact, at the OECD to get this convention up and running, the Multilateral Convention on Administrative Assistance. A convention that was ahead of its time.
Yeah.
Then it got the support of the G20, so it was the standard was brought up to date, on the bank secrecy issue. Now you have 61 countries that have signed it, yeah? Is this something that you would recommend that developing countries should get involved in? I mean, there are already some there, but...
Well, I think they should certainly look at it. I wouldn't recommend one way or the other, because it depends on the situation. I think it's a good development to multilateralise some of these issues. I've always felt that there should be more multilateral attempts on double taxation treaties.
Well, the League of Nations began by proposing actually a multilateral one.
Yeah, and I've always wondered if the reason it doesn't happen is because negotiators like to travel to exotic countries bilaterally. Yes. Speaking as a former negotiator, although I did most of the work at home, but I've often wondered if that has an impact, but yes, perhaps that is a little bit cynical. So in principle, I think some of these areas need to be multilateralised. Now that convention, there's a few things that they would need to look at. One is that developing countries aren't entitled as of right to be members, and I know that's a technical thing, but it sort of sends the wrong message. So I hope in the future we have something which is a little bit, it might be based upon requirements about meeting confidentiality and so.
And that is one of the sort of the base points, isn't it?
And when you look at the surrounding documents to that convention, really the OECD is the body for all, I think it's opinions and so forth in relation to that, which, in a sense, it's, I'm not sure the UN could do that at the moment, so I'm not necessarily saying that the UN should have a similar part in that, but I think in the future, that was essentially an OECD, Council of Europe convention, which was made broader, and I'm not blaming anyone for some of those aspects of it, but I think in the future we have to think in a more thoroughgoing way, how do we have, if we have a multilateral approach, how do we have one which says you're equal at the table, the body that looks after it is one of which you are a party, a member, and so forth. So, but that's not a criticism. It's a step, and it's up to countries. Again, by signing up to that, they may lose a little bit of leverage on a bilateral double tax agreement, but that's a decision for them to take. But it's a way of dealing with a lack of specific treaties on exchange.
I think that's quite a sort of a nice way to go into the fifth point, which is on the BEPS. Yes? You can't talk about tax these days without mentioning BEPS. Yes? It seems to be everywhere. We are BEPing all over the place. Yeah. So how are the views of developing countries going to be fed into the BEPS debate? What role does the UN group have there?
Well, it's an OECD G20 agenda, And, you know, we're supportive of any action against base erosion and profit shifting. I guess the point I would make is that concern about that wasn't invented by the OECD, that the UN Tax Committee has always been concerned about base erosion and profit shifting. The best answer to what you've said is to mention the mandate of the new subcommittee that's been set up on base erosion and profit shifting.
This is set up at your last meeting in October?
Yes, in October. It'll be on the website very shortly. And really the key points of that are that the subcommittee will have a role in monitoring what's happening, and some of the people on it are involved in the OECD work, some aren't, in informing developing countries. Who's
going to chair that group, if I may ask?
It's a lady called Carmel Peters from New Zealand, in her personal capacity, I should say. It will only be members from government, and because this is seen as...
it's not the same composition as the full committee where you have business and NGOs?
The full committee is only people nominated by governments, and this year I think it's all people from government. But we also have observers at the committee.
Very active observers,
yeah,
as of the last meeting.
And some of our, yes, very active, which is good. Yeah. And subcommittee, well, sometimes good, sometimes it depends on the quality of the intervention. But it was felt that this was a subcommittee where it was a governmental issue that needed to be addressed. Some of the other subcommittees, like transfer pricing, do have some people from the private sector involved, and academics and so forth. And its mandate is, as I say, monitoring, informing developing countries of what's happening. It will engage with developing countries about what's happening, and will seek their comments. And this is where we have not a fork in the road, but the road will diverge and converge at separate places. Because one thing they will do is they'll feed that into the UN work. And this is why the mandate differentiates between big BBEPs, the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Action Plan of the OECD G20, and small BBEPs, which is the continuing concern of the UN in dealing with base erosion and profit shifting. So some of it will feed into what we're doing, but we will also feed it into the OECD work. How they take that on board, if they do, that's up to them. I mean, we can't tell them how to run their work. But for me, the relevance is that you might get some feedback which is not part of the action plan. And there might be, for example, we strongly believe that we need more source country taxation in the world of the digital economy, which is not really part of the action plan. It's said that it's not its intention to sort of change.
Well, that's the view of some large OECD countries, yes? But not of all OECD countries. Yes?
Well, it's in the plan. I mean, it's worded in a way which said, not directly going to address that question.
How do you discuss P issues without?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. Personally, I think it's hard to discuss PE issues. It's hard to discuss taxation of the digital economy without. If you were to seek a consensus, I think at the present moment you would need more source state taxation than in the headline OECD model at the moment. But I guess it could be said, well, there is no actual subdivision between source and residence country taxation. There's no uniform agreement on that at the moment. So, countries won't be forced to have more source taxation or less. Although I think it's more a question of whether there's more or about the same.
Less.
Yeah. So, I think that that's an issue, but I think the outcome will be that you couldn't get a consensus on some of these issues, so that you'll just have to live without a consensus, but with transparency as to what's been achieved, which, as I've said, is often our model in the UN, and saying, well, we can't get complete consensus, but we can narrow the points of difference. We can maybe have a few options rather than 100, and we can explain the pros and cons of different approaches.
On the big issues like the PE, I mean, it does seem to me that OECD is a little bit more open, perhaps, to actually say, well, we need to reconsider this concept. The UN perhaps a bit more open as well. So there may be some room for convergence here, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, if we can achieve greater convergence, then I think that's useful. We got greater convergence on services.
Yep.
The fact that there's something, even a minority approach in the OECD where there wasn't anything before, I think was a significant development. And at some stage we will actually look, their drafting might be better than ours in some respect. I think maybe in some respects yes, maybe in some respects ours is better. So I think we should always seek, I always say we should seek consensus, but you've got to recognise where consensus is not possible, and that's where I think it's best to recognise that, and so that you don't give the appearance of consensus when you don't have it, and then that will break down at some stage.
And that's not in the interest of government or in business.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's not real certainty.
I was always very favourable on the transfer pricing guidelines to allow countries to set out their positions, because what was happening a lot on the guidelines that you were fudging differences in countries' views so that you get an apparent consensus, and then that consensus was not being applied. And I think one way of dealing with that was actually to have, like for the model, you could have countries put in observations. The other comment I would make is that I do think you're right that we are going to see more source country taxation, and it's going to be primarily in the area of withholding taxes. I mean, when the Netherlands tells African countries we are open now to move away from our policy of zero withholding, that's a big change.
I think
the Netherlands can do it.
Yeah,
maybe other
and I think this is a classic example where we might get whether you regard it as something missing from BEPS, or whether you regard it as something where it's not relevant to the OECD BEPS work, but it will certainly be relevant to the UN BEPS work, small b BEPS, if countries come back, as I expect, and say, well, we need strong withholding taxes, because I think withholding taxes, it's always very unfashionable when I mention in a business audience that part of the solution to some of the problems which everyone I think acknowledges now are strong withholding taxes, not madly so high that you don't get the benefit, you don't strangle the golden goose, but they are part of the solution for developing countries, and it's not really part of BEPS. Something else that is potentially part of BEPS is, but maybe more important to developing countries, is denying deductions when payments are made to what are sometimes called tax havens. We don't usually use that term because it's a misused term, and small countries are sometimes branded for practices which might not be any worse than happening in big countries that we don't think of in that term. But that's another potential. They're often rough solutions. They need to be joined with good administration, so that the withholding, if there's a refund system, that the refunding system works, for example.
Even some OECD countries are not very good at refunding.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, you're probably thinking of the same countries that I'm thinking of. But so these are some of the issues where I think our base erosion and profit shifting agenda may be a little different. Not because there's any philosophical difference with the UN and between the UN and the OECD, but because what works for developing countries, the benefit of a withholding tax regime might far outweigh the bluntness of it for those countries, whereas for a developed economy, the benefits are outweighed by the costs as they see it, and it's a decision for them. So I think
if you follow the logic of that, maybe in fact what developing countries should be doing is asking countries like Switzerland to have these rubric agreements. Interesting idea.
Well,
and we'll pass on that. One thing you've not mentioned, Michael, on the BEPS is the action point number 5, harmful tax practices. You don't see those being relevant to developing countries in any way? And the issue of tax incentives and the competition there?
Well, I mean, tax incentives is a huge issue, and I think that will be one of the issues for our extractives subcommittee, the new subcommittee on extractives, which I don't think we've mentioned in any detail. Oh, it's next.
The next item.
I won't say too much.
It's nice.
Yeah, it's a recognised problem, and it was recognised in that report from 2011 that we mentioned that incentives are often given away when they're not necessary, particularly in, say, mining or other extractive industries, they're often not necessary. The person is going to come, or the company is going to come, investors going to come anyway. And even when they're there, they're often not given out by the tax body, though they may not know anything about it.
But
they're not transparent.
In many countries, the finance minister learns about the incentive by reading the newspaper, yeah?
Yeah, or even when they do a tax audit and something is shown. So, you know, there are some governance issues with that, but there are some real issues that one country has played off against the other. So, you know, whether it's treated as harmful tax competition, or whether it's just treated as behaviour that's not even useful to you.
Yeah. But wouldn't that be a case, in fact, for seeing whether you could get the UN committee to have a look at the 98 report on harmful tax competition, and to see, in fact, whether there was a sufficient consensus within the committee to say this is something we could broadly endorse, maybe with some amendments?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's something that someone at the meeting, an observer, as you've been, could raise, or someone within the committee could raise. That hasn't, to my knowledge, been raised specifically, perhaps because so much emphasis is now on the BEPS agenda, that there's less emphasis on that, specifically on that OECD work. And there was some very good work done in that area. There was also criticism in some areas that it targeted certain countries and so forth.
You mean targeted Michael? We never targeted countries. You know, one of the interesting things today is because when you look at the work that the OECD did on exchange of information, and bank secrecy, we had a pretty clear definition of a tax haven. Yeah, you can't define a tax haven today. No. Because, you know, they all in principle are prepared to exchange information. They don't have bank. So in a sense, I think in today's environment, we all have a little bit of elements of a tax haven. Yeah, we're all sinners. Huh?
Well, you know, it is very interesting. It's just that's not a criticism of that work, but it was genuinely a lot of the small countries in the UN said it's not a level playing field. If we do something, we get targeted. If others do, they might get away with it if they're big enough. And you know, I'm not commenting specifically on the rights and wrongs of that, but it's always something we have to be very sensitive, which shows that anything like that needs to be done in a process of engagement with all those involved.
Well, I suppose you have that now with the Global Forum, you know, 120 odd countries. They're meeting this week in Jakarta. They're going to be looking at the issue of ratings, which comes down to your issue of are big countries going to be rated in the same fashion as small countries. They're going to look at the issue of automatic exchange. I mean, this is going to be a rather interesting meeting in Jakarta. Yeah,
my boss is actually there. So the UN participates in that work, and you know, I think it's important that we do participate as much as we can. Our limited resources make it difficult. Everyone is saying now that the IMF, World Bank, OECD and the UN should meet more regularly, should discuss their work with each other to avoid unnecessary duplication, which I agree with. The problem is the resourcing and the use of the amount of time we spent on that 2011 report, and sometimes I feel like a small developing country with only very limited resources to devote to that.
That raises an issue. I mean, you get big countries like China and India and Brazil that say how important your committee is. Why aren't they putting their money where their mouths are? Yeah? I mean, $1 million for China or India, it's peanuts. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think we've shown in the transfer pricing manual part of its relevance was Chapter 10, where China and India and Brazil and South Africa too had the chance to give their perspective, and I think that was a very important vehicle for some developing country views. And you know, I hope that they see our work as worthy enough that it will be, you know, more resourced than it has been. We have to make sure that it's seen as important work. I think we being the committee first and foremost, and secondly the Secretariat, I think we've done a pretty good job on that, and I think we'll continue to. But yes, we do have to speak to more countries and say, if you want this work to continue, you do have to support it, because it can't be self-supporting. And the more we can have resourcing, the more we can do.
How many people work with you now?
Well, there's two sides. There's the policy side and the capacity building. I'm not sure exactly the numbers in capacity building, but on the policy side, which is the direct service to the committee, it's professional people. It's two, of which I'm the tax person with the tax background. I have a very good colleague from Rwanda who's from a public sector, public service type background. But also Germany has lent us a very good young person for 2 years, and we've had Norway has lent us some good people in the past.
So about 3 or 4 people altogether then?
3 altogether, yes. But there's no certainty about that always.
So you can put that in perspective. The OECD has about 165 people, and the IMF have about 70 or 80 people, yeah? And the World Bank, probably you're talking about 20, 25, yeah? Something ain't right here.
It's too small. it is too small.
Well,
but it achieves a lot.
$1 million from each of the BRICS. You got 5 million, 5 million. You can go up from 3 to 40 people very quickly.
Yes, yes. But we'll bore the listeners if we talk about resourcing too much.
Okay. Why don't we move to the last sort of round, which is on, in fact, and we've started the debate a little bit on the natural resources. Again, what's the function of this group? How will it interact with other, organisations like the Fund or the EU or the World Bank?
Well, it's a very good question, because we're conscious, being so small, that we think there's a UN value add, and we often think there's a UN value add because, tiny though we are, I think we have a brand that we are genuinely trying to reach something that works for developing countries, and that's balanced and is credible for investors too. So I think with the UN's universality and what they call its convening power, the fact that we work with multi-stakeholders, we invited NGOs and also business to speak to our members at a pre-meeting before the Geneva meeting, just to introduce their thoughts, to get to know the members, and for a recognition that we can't, government people can't be the only people speaking to these debates. There's a liquefied natural gas proposal off Tanzania, which I think it's estimated will cost 10 to 14 billion dollars for that plant, and Statoil is involved, as I recall, from Norway. And that's a big investment. So, certainty is important, but on the other hand, countries genuinely want to know that their extractives are, that undue rents are not being earned on their extractives, and that the taxpayer is getting the benefit of those resources. So it will be a subcommittee which will be comprised of government people, but also of people from the private sector, at least. And we hope we will certainly be inviting representatives from the World Bank, the IMF and the OECD to participate in that, because we realise the technical expertise. Having worked at the OECD myself, I'm recognising of their technical expertise and their expertise in policy areas as well. So I think that's part of the answer. We will look to see where we can add value. Getting back to this theme, everyone says you shouldn't duplicate what's already been done, and I agree with that in principle, but that doesn't mean that where a developing country wants a second opinion from a second doctor, we shouldn't be there. Sometimes that argument is used as an excuse to say, well, you shouldn't work on extractives because the IMF is working on extractives, the World Bank, the OECD, you shouldn't work on it. And I don't think that's the right answer, the answer to say, well, are there parts of it where we can add value in the eyes of our stakeholders, which is the membership of the UN. And ultimately that subcommittee's first task will be to say, well, can we identify areas where we can? And one of the things I think that might be is pulling together some of the different tax issues in this area. For example, in a lot of countries with mines, one of the issues is where the mines aren't sold directly. There's an interposed company in another country that is sold. And this was an issue when I was in Australia, and it's an issue for a lot of countries. Very difficult to deal with. It's not a, you know, it's not a specifically extractives issue. It's not a specifically developing country issue, but it's a very big issue for a lot of those countries. So how do we tie together these? And maybe one suggestion, which I think has been fairly well received by the committee, is that we have policy and administration notes. We don't have another manual, but we have notes about some of the issues, some of the pros and cons of different approaches, some of the things you should be aware of. You know, maybe there'll even be checklists of things to look at and so forth. This is ultimately for the subcommittee and then the committee, but you know, I rarely say this, but I'm very excited by this work because I think we can do something. There's a very strong African aspect to this subcommittee. We can do something that's good for them, but also for other regions, and with a small amount of effort and resourcing, we can actually make their job a little bit easier and maybe reduce in some way the so-called resource curse.
Well, yeah, given the enthusiasm you have for that, that leads us quite nicely. But one of the last questions that I had is so where's the UN Tax Committee going to be in 10 years' time? And will it be with or without you?
10 years is a long time. Well, the committee itself, I think it's been under very good leadership for many years now, various leaders, and this is a very strong committee that we've got. I said that of the last committee, and I can say that again. I hope we have more LDCs, the least developed countries, on it. We don't get a lot of nominations.
Why is that?
I think they have so many issues on their plate, and maybe it's partly a branding issue because it's actually, and I know this has been something you've been thinking about. It's not just a committee about international taxation. It's about international cooperation in tax matters. So it does have a role in assisting countries deal with domestic tax issues, such as in the extractives area. So, you know, I think it'll be stronger. As I've said, a personal view is it will probably be country representatives formally representing their country. Hopefully it's a lot better resourced. And as for me, I think that would be just before retirement age, but I'm not sure.
Tax people don't seem to retire, given my experience.
Yeah, that's true. I'm not sure where I'll end up. I'm always reminded when people ask me this. I think the best answer is there's an Australian High Court judge, very colourful and very influential, who one day dealt with a case about someone who had an argument with someone else and was put into jail on hard labour, and this judge, Justice Lionel Murphy, went through the history of agitators and the importance of agitators in the imperfect society, and in the end his conclusion, which is a very famous Australian legal saying, is Mr. Neil is entitled to be an agitator. So I hope I'm still agitating, and maybe... I
think that's a lovely way to sort of end this. We do have time for a few questions, so if you just announce your name, would like to put any questions? It's a great opportunity for Michael. Yep, let's take... Okay, we'll take...
I have a question regarding the way of solving the issues related to transfer pricing and the arm's length principle. We have now the proposal for the global formal apportionment that, as you said, it doesn't work because it needs an international multilateral consensus. We have the safe harbor proposal, but the safe harbor proposal to me has the main issues that first of all is safe for the multinationals, which means that whenever a multinational is going to win out of the use of the safe harbor, it's going to use it, otherwise it's going to go to the arm's length principle again. And the second issue is that it needs again multilateral consensus, otherwise we're still going to have issues of double taxation, double non-taxation. So don't you think that the response and the solution to the arm's length principle might be improving the APA procedures multilaterally and multilateral procedure having even mandatory arbitration multilaterally?
Yeah, so just to repeat, so the question really is, given some of the difficulties of applying the arm's length principle, do we need to look again at alternative dispute resolution mechanisms and in particular arbitration? That's a good question.
It's a
Michael.
very good question. Yeah, it's.
I was trying to avoid asking you that.
Yeah. No. It's a good, and we have slightly different views, so that hopefully will give a little bit of agitation and excitement. Safe harbours, you know, I agree they're imperfect, and I think when they're talked about, it's often as a stage in the journey. And of course, you can't forget. I agree that the taxpayer has to choose them, and they have to be well designed and make sure that. You know, they continue to yield the benefits. And one of the benefits is that they reduce the opportunity cost of using your best and brightest in dealing with some of those things. So that's where the benefit is seen. They simplify the application of the rules. They encourage investment, but they shouldn't be, you know, part of the race to the bottom that we've talked about. And I think there has to be an international acceptance that developing countries should be allowed to use safe harbours for a certain period of time at least. I mean, one of the other developments is profit splits becoming more and more prominent. And you know, I'm probably with the people who say that the profit split approach has a lot in common with aspects of formulary apportionment. Not everyone agrees. I think we need to have more discussion about, you know, what the proper profit split is. APAs, well, APAs in the long run I think are very important. They give certainty, but you need to really know about transfer pricing before you have an APA. So although they have a role in training, as Jeffrey mentioned, in some ways it's a sad state of affairs if you say your best training opportunity is doing an APA.
Why? That's the time when you can discuss with business.
Yeah, but developed countries should be assisting developing countries more so that they have training before they get into the transfer pricing regime. Maybe
there's more of a conflict between the interests of developed and developing countries than the interests of developing countries and business.
Possibly. But I think, you know, they do have a role. In the long run, a very important role. But I think for a lot of developing countries, they say in the early years, until I really know the system, I might be using my best people in the wrong areas, and B, I'm not really sure whether we'll have a result that is a good result. So even India took a while to get into APAs, which is a topic by itself probably. Finally, arbitration. I'm on record as saying I'm an international lawyer. I'm very pro arbitration as a way of solving problems, and I always say that. And then Carol Donoghue, who's done a lot of this area, waits for the but. And the but is that arbitration is a science, and a lot of developing countries have had their, you know, it's a real industry actually, the international commercial arbitration and international investment arbitration. A lot of developing countries have had their fingers burnt on international arbitration. A, it can be very costly. B, it's very secret, and C, it is an art form, doing a presentation in an arbitration in a way which will get the right result. Now, there's short form versions, which the UN model gives arbitration as an alternative. It's less all the way with arbitration than the OECD model. It has a short form which tries to deal with some of the cost issues, but that means that the arbitrator just picks the proposal from the, let's say, the developed country or from the developing country. And, you know, that may not, unless you really know arbitration and know what that arbitrator's done in the past, there's some issues there about whether you'll be able to find the right thing to argue, but more importantly, how you present it, the flashiness of your PowerPoints, and whether you've got experienced people from very expensive firms involved. Yeah, and it's a concern. There's also a concern that not enough developing country people would be involved in arbitration. These can all be dealt with, but what I always say is, you know, developed countries were not for arbitration in this area for a long time. Then in a few years, through some good work in the OECD, and I was involved with some of the people working on that, it's now the OECD, well, it's the standard in the model. I mean, it doesn't get adopted that often in bilateral treaties. But you know, there are some issues about what that means for developing countries, and some of them say to me, well, the OECD countries were against it for so long, and they're so far ahead of us in their tax administration. Now they're so for it, why should I so quickly change my opinion? I need to be convinced.
Because it could be in their interest,
yeah.
yes. But
it could be, but they have to be able to, they shouldn't be forced. They should be, it should be sold. It shouldn't be oversold, it shouldn't be undersold, but it should be sold. And I wrote an article recently, partly as part of that debate, you know, the debate of in what circumstances is it good for developing countries? What are some of the clauses they might need in there? And, you know, I think that will hopefully, better people than me will take up that, and we'll end up with something which has all the benefits of arbitration without some of the burdens.
And I think, you know, that the UN could do quite a lot in addressing the cost issue, establishing a panel of arbitrators. I mean, there's a whole set of things you can do, yeah? But that's a debate for the next five. Veronica, you want to? We're going to have, sorry, one question up here for a moment, and then go ahead, yeah?
My name is Veronica Daumer. My question is a little bit less technical, maybe a little bit more philosophical, concerns the term developing country. You were saying that the UN model was especially used for developing countries, but it covers so many different developing countries. Like you said, the BRICS, they are very strong, big countries. They have a lot of voice in the committee already, I think. And then there are smaller ones, the ABCs, and you also said it would be very important to have them on the committee a little bit more in the future. But don't you think that right now it's already very important to a little bit more stress the interests of them as well? Because they're right now starting with their treaty network, and it would be very important to just look at them a little bit more closely at the moment already.
Yeah, it's another very good question, as I expect at this university. It's you know, it's something we're conscious of. We've actually, I think, doubled the representation of developing countries, which is a technical UN category. I think it's Zambia and Senegal, I think, for the moment. It was previously, I think, just Senegal. But we do try to, and the committee does try to bring the views that we know of, that we get from other forums, into their work. But we constantly should test what we do and say, how does it work on these countries? Are we focusing our program too much on countries which are a bit higher up in the development journey? And Lisa Latkana, who I think teaches at this university occasionally, makes the point that we're all developing countries, really. And we use that term because it's a technical term, but we recognise, for example, that in transfer pricing, some of the issues for India and China, as expressed in Chapter 10, not only might not be issues for other developing countries or some other developing countries at the moment, but for them to look at that and say, that's great, let's apply those same principles to our transfer pricing work. It just may not work because they may not have the markets, they may not be able to have investment come on the same terms that China and India will. So those are very important issues, and we always have to try to do better in making sure that our constituency, that's the disadvantage of 193 members, and it's actually an issue for the OECD. As the OECD is becoming bigger and broader and engaging more with developing countries, you know, it's so much harder to get a consensus, and it's so much more often you have to use the diplomatic skills in this area. And I think work in the OECD has changed a bit since I was there. I think there has to be more diplomatic skills involved. But the upside is that if you do get a general agreement, it has much broader ownership and is much broader than to be acceptable than if you just look at what works for developed countries, or even, you know, developing countries who are more developed than others.
Yeah, there is a question from the online audience. Sofia Murillo Lopez asks, the question is whether the UN committee plans to address in the future the effects of international fiscal policies on redistribution of income in developing countries?
Well, as I take it, it's probably a governance issue, and you know, governance is always an issue for the UN. That's not specifically on the agenda, but certainly in an area like extractives, you have to recognise that if you don't have you know, a pro-poor approach in your fiscal policy, you won't get the engagement of the wider population, just as if you don't have a tax administration which is seen as not as having integrity. If you don't have that, then people won't have any incentive to pay their tax where they otherwise would. So that's not specifically on the agenda, but it permeates our work. But the only thing I'd say is that too often, you know, criticism of developing countries neglects some of the really good things that are happening. And Jeffrey's seen some of the developments, you know, in the various regions of the world where countries are making enormous efforts to have integrity, to show that what they're doing is pro-poor, and that's why they need to have a system which is not just completely pro-investment, but which encourages the right sort of investment, which encourages investment that gives some sort of revenue return, so that can be fed into dealing with bringing people up from poverty. It's essential. That's why financing for development is so important. Financing meeting the Millennium Development Goals and beyond. It permeates our work, and I think it permeates the committee's work. That's why having funds for development is so important part of the mandate.
I think that's a very nice way to finish this fireside chat. I'd like to thank Michael. You know, I think it's been a great, great exchange. This is the last in the series for this year, so there won't be any more fireside chats until the new year. Next year, we hope to have between 4 and 6. We'll announce it well in advance so you can participate.
And a fire.
And I hope we're going to have a fire. Yeah, this is something I have to take up with Professor Lang. And as I said at the beginning, as of now, we will start publishing either the full transcripts or extracts, in fact, from these fireside chats, so that people that haven't been able to plug in one way or the other are able to benefit from it. So thank you very much, Michael. Thank the audience, both the audience that is here and the audience that is there. Yep. Thank you very much. Yep.